Ja, herzlichen Dank. I mean, it's a tremendous thing to speak after that interview. I mean, that was really fantastic. And if I may, before I move on to my own topic in English, in German, just two comments. First of all, I would join Adam Curtis in recommending to everybody Charles Dickens' book, Bleak House. It's the ultimate novel about the law, how it works, the absurdities, the labyrinth you get in. I think I remember that Stefan Kuriot is a fan of that book as well. I read it while I was working for a law firm in London many years ago. Once you are through that book, you can move on to Kafka's Der Prozess, but it's very similar. The second thing is about what Adam said about politicians being managers. I think what the people, and maybe also we in this room, consistently do is we want politicians who are in fact managers making us believe that they can do more than they can do. So we force them to oversell consistently, whether it's Obama with Yes We Can, or whether it's Trump with America First. And insofar, that's a dialectic relationship between the people and the politicians. Who expects what from who? Nun muss ich Sie aus.
And now I'm going to have to bring you down to earth and down to tax law. This is probably the hardest task you've ever given me, Miss Frick. We feel as artists as well. We are artists working in tax law because tax law is to reflect the world. Everything that happens in our world, in our society, and maybe in art as well, is then taken up in tax law. It's reflected upon, assessed, and then you are told what you have to pay. If you want to know how a country treats a family, ask about their splitting amounts. If you ask about the top tax rates, and if you want to know how a country sees its environment, then you can talk about the eco taxes. Then you'll see pretty much what the situation it is. And that is basically what I'm going to be talking about today. Digitalization. How do taxes consider digital capitalism? Well, let's begin with a picture from the 19th century, or maybe from the 20th century. Here we have a closed economy. You have manufacturers. We call them producers. They have employees. They have a plant, a factory with smoke coming out of the chimneys. You might have a sales office. And in the 20th century, they might have had a research department. But this is all pretty much brick and mortar. And tomorrow the employees go, in the morning they go to the factory, they leave again in the evening and go home. How can we distinguish them? We see the manufacturers, we see the employees, and we might also see the capitalists who fund all of this with equity, with borrowings. And you can make this even more complicated with intermediaries, private equity funds, etc. But this is a rather constant picture. It's a picture which the tax regulations have been based on and react to for many years now. You talk about corporate taxes, and we also have the payroll taxes. You have interest and dividends that are taken into account in taxes. And then the consumers, here we have the value-added tax or other types of taxes. Now, this is something that came before digitalization, and then we have globalization, we have tax competition, and we also have to see that this was before digitalization, but this has become even more distinct. So we can see that there is some movability in the system, which means that the manufacturer can move his plant, and this can exert pressure on corporate taxes. Take a look at Germany. This is a country with high taxes, they say, and ever since I studied, and that's quite a long time ago now, but corporate tax has gone from 56% and it's gone down to 15%. So 41% less, even though we now have trade tax on top. So it is much lower with regard to income tax or payroll taxes, where we then also went from 56% to 47%. Then we have the solidarity charge, etc. But nonetheless, things have changed. So the economies have become more open, and the companies can be moved. What happens now as a result of digitalization? It draws a totally different picture. And this different picture is something that taxes have to react to, and they do. It begins, first of all, with the question, who is the employee? Who is the employer? Who is the producer? Who is the plant worker? And what about those who take Uber instead of a taxi? Are they an employee? The driver, is this an employee? And are they their own capitalists and they provide a car? Is this someone who we see in terms of labor law, etc.? Can they be included in these typical categories? Trump's tax reform in the United States has meant that for self-employed, etc., this meant that there were a lot of tax deductions. But now the employees are now placed with the same question. Do they all want to turn into small self-employed people so that they can benefit from these tax advantages? Or do they also want to continue to have whatever the small amount of protection that they have? That's the first change. The limits between the employee and the factory owner. And then we see value-added taxes now being charged on Airbnb because we see them as entrepreneurs, and they weren't seen as such in the past. These aren't the people who really make the big profits. The profits are made by those who operate the platform behind all of this. You could be talking about Uber, social networks, Expedia, Booking.com, or you could also refer to Airbnb. And those who, they may not even be in the same country. They have algorithms somewhere, developed somewhere. They have the patents, and the processes have been put somewhere, anywhere, all over the world. And this leads to a major acceleration in tax competition. Because if that's the way it is, if these intangibles, which actually are the value drivers and the people driving the Uber cars, or if they have their Airbnb cost substitution in a certain type of earnings, a small amount, then we talk about the mobility of the plant, which isn't all that easy. This is something which becomes the mobility of patents, know-how, algorithms, and all of the things that you really have and that can be moved in just a matter of seconds around the world. So there's more mobility than what we have in financial capital, because if you talk about financial capital and you put it in a tax haven, then it won't be productive. It has to go somewhere else. It has to go to an industrialized company. But this is somewhat different when we talk about intangibles. And this meant that in the last few years, tax competition has increased considerably, and a lot of models to try to avoid taxes. Think of Apple. All of these were triggered because of this. Apple, of course, has its R&D center. It conducted R&D in California, and the smartphones were produced in China. But it's also true that the profits were achieved through know-how, patents, brand names, and these were all parked in Ireland, where they have very, very low tax rates. So you can try to proceed against them with the International Tax Code, as the OECD is trying to do. You can also try to address this by applying tax subsidies, which the European Commission is trying to do sometimes. But this means that you have a type of competition between the different countries. And the U.S. government takes the proceedings of the European Commission against the digital companies in European subsidy law is seen as just as aggressive as the European cities or states see how the Americans act when it comes to customs and duties on steel, etc. So what does this mean? If financial capital is mobile, intangibles are mobile, if I don't have the plant at the place it is, what is not mobile? What can the tax authorities get taxes from? Well, people say the customers. The customers are stable. They don't run away all that easily. So they are covered with value-added tax, but you can take it even further. The Trump government had a plan a year ago, and they wanted to put corporate tax on imports. That means that all of the international companies would be paying corporate taxes and income taxes in the United States if they achieve profits with customers there. And we also see the plans from the European Union that were presented recently. The digital providers from the United States would be charged a digital tax. That's where the customers are, that's where the social networks are, and wherever the ads are shown on Facebook, Instagram, etc. That is where taxes are to be paid. Well, this then, if you look at it from the point of view of the European countries, this leads to a very tricky question, and it's related to something we've heard again today, the relationship between old and new economies. The German economy, or the European economy, has always assumed that profits are to be taxed where production is done. Daimler is willing to pay taxes in Germany, but not necessarily in China, where their customers are. And this applies to Louis Vuitton in France, Gucci in Italy. We deliver the bags to China, but the taxes should be paid here. So if the Europeans, and this is the very interesting question right now, if Europeans say that the profits from digital companies should be taxed in Europe for the European customers, what would stop the Chinese and the Indians to tax profits from the old economy, from the exports there? So we have the following idea on this. Isn't this a new world we're living in? Isn't this a world where more happens than just exporting in order to have customers? Don't we have new added value? Here we have data that are being used. We have also, and this is the image we have of the holistic view of Internet users, which is one huge coal mine where the operators of the digital economy get their information and their material. But this leads to very difficult questions. If a customer provides data and gets something for us, then of course you can tax them. If you want to post a cat video on YouTube and it can generate tens of thousands of euros, then of course income taxes have to be paid on this. And it's the one who carries out these uses. Are these all just barters? We all assume that Google, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter can be used free of charge. Is that really free of charge? Or aren't we getting a service, entertainment, communication, etc., and that we give something for this? In other words, data and the advertising brochures. Somebody from a Silicon Valley company said to me, what's the difference between Spotify if they provide streamings for 10 euros a month? This is an economic business that will be taxed. And if they don't charge anything and they get advertising space instead, well, that is very difficult to draw the line. So at the end of this whole process, what do we have? At the end of the whole process, you might have a situation where maybe you no longer have employees, but the customer becomes a producer. Let's take the idea that all of us, in 10 years' time, we will all have a 3D printer in our homes, and every device we need can be produced immediately. The only thing we still need to buy is the program that is stored in Singapore and the software that tells us how a specific hammer, knife, or whatever can be produced. Where do you get the added value? Where is it? We're entering a world where everyone is their own individual manufacturer. How are we going to tax this? Income taxes? Value-added taxes? I read an article quite recently about, and I got a letter from a German economist, and he said we have to see the limits between self-supply and third-party production. These are things that may need to be redefined. And this brings me to my next point. To what extent is labor becoming superfluous? And how should tax laws react to this? I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot tell you to what extent artificial intelligence and modern data processing will mean that jobs will be lost. Now, if jobs are lost, if services are only between a software manufacturer who could be anywhere and a customer who might still be in Germany, well, how is this going to be done tax-wise? How will the tax burden be distributed? Now, the idea that we have to consider now, and this is something that was hardly touched upon today, I think it was in one comment, by the way, well, we need a machine tax. Do we need a tax on robots? That would then be able to take the profits, which would be for the owner of the software, or for those who own the hardware installations. And how would this then be distributed? And now the biggest problem, and I think this is a problem that really hasn't been solved yet, it's just these things which are subject to tax competition. So any attempt to introduce a robot tax might work very well in a closed economy, but it won't work if the capital we're talking about here and the investments we're talking about can be shifted and relocated somewhere else. Then we have international tax competition with regard to taxes on robots, and that's something we would lose. So what remains? Well, maybe the owner of the capital. In other words, those who take the earnings from this mobile production factors, they would then be earning dividends and interest. How mobile are they, the ones with all the capital? They're certainly not more mobile than a simple customer. They might be more mobile than a simple employee, but they would not be willing to move all the time just to avoid taxes. So that means we might end up in a world where mobility of intangibles will not be able to be determined in terms of taxes, and we might have the possibility to see a customer who's willing to pay for services, and they may have to pay taxes, and we would hope that those who get the yield would then be able to charge them a capital gains tax. I think that's all there is to it. Thank you very much.